Perfect. Next slide, please. Yes, this is a little bit about me. Thank you so much, Kim, for that introduction. So what we're going to be doing today is really talking about not only how to utilize the amazing foods that are finally coming about in spring. Currently in Virginia, it is snowing, so it doesn't really feel like it's spring right now. But definitely we're going to really focus on seasonality in regards to this particular workshop. And so actually, I'm originally from Los Angeles, California. So if y'all could do me a favor, if you can actually put down where you're currently at right now watching this workshop, I'd really appreciate it, so that way I can engage with you all more. And so for this particular kind of what to expect with this workshop, the first thing we're going to actually talk about is what is zero waste cooking. So there are a lot of really wonderful strategies to really do, especially in the cooking process, to becoming more zero waste and to be more sustainable. We're going to kind of talk about those strategies specifically in this workshop. And then afterwards, we're going to actually kind of talk about how seasonality specifically and sustainability really go hand in hand with one another. That if you really strive to kind of eat more seasonally, it kind of inherently allows you to be more sustainable in regards to not only getting the benefits of having a more sustainable lifestyle, but also you get the benefits of just, supporting your local produce and your farmers and things like that. And so specifically, the three main components of this class are going to be talking about specific cooking tips in regards to how to embrace zero waste. So for me, for this class, we're making a spring minestrone soup, which I made yesterday, and I got a lot of fun videos for you all to watch at the very end of the class. And so soup for me is like the perfect representation of what sustainable food can look like, because you can really use all parts of your wonderful vegetables that are out there to make a really flavorful soup with really simple, amazing kind of ingredients and also techniques as well that I'll kind of talk about during that particular portion. And then my favorite personal thing when it comes to kind of actually eating more sustainably and also more seasonally is pestos are a freezer's best friend. So I love kind of preserving my food so I don't have to think about it as much. So I'll kind of talk about why the pesto is so great for that and kind of give you all a little bit of fun ideas and how to kind of jazz it up a little bit too. And then for bread specifically, so that's going to be the thing that I think post-COVID, I hope that fad stays. The reason why is because it's really a fantastic way to reduce your plastic, especially single-use plastic reduction, if you do work to kind of like bake more and, especially with bread, because who doesn't love bread? And then we're going to actually get to cooking, and then I'll talk about key takeaways, and there will be a lovely question and answer period at the very end of this workshop. So next slide. All right, so if y'all can do me a quick favor, if you can actually write down in the chat what exactly to you zero waste cooking is. I kind of would love to get your perspective, and then we can kind of like talk about different strategies in how we can achieve zero waste cooking would be great. And I actually see somebody's in the chats from Monrovia. That's super close to where I'm from in Pasadena, so welcome. Okay, so I'll give everybody a second. So let's go to the next slide please, Kim. So for me, kind of the 3 R's when I think of when it comes to zero waste cooking are definitely reduce, reuse, and I like to use the term reinvent when it comes to zero waste cooking because I think it's a really wonderful opportunity to kind of really reimagine your food. I like not throwing stuff away, hate to do that, absolutely. Everything is eaten or cooked or composted. I love that, Barbara. And then Michael, using all parts of the food, absolutely. And I think one of the things as well that really goes hand in hand with zero waste cooking is really being tactful in regards to as much as you can using as much reusable products as possible when it comes to buying and also utilizing and cooking your food to be as zero waste as possible. Next slide. So this is kind of a little bit of a fact as to why zero waste cooking is really something that I really try to deeply embrace in my life. So per year, 219 pounds of waste is per person. It's astronomical to me how much it is. That's 30 to 40% of our entire US food supply. And so the thing that is in regards to food waste is that it's an easy thing to fix. I don't think in the United States we have a really big problem in producing food. It's how we store it and how we waste it. I used to work in the restaurant industry before I started actually teaching folks how to cook. And to see the amount of food waste that would go through, it was sad. It was really sad to me. It's one of the reasons why, for me personally, I'm extremely passionate about whenever I do talk about nutrition, whenever I talk about cooking, which is my love, the love of my life in regards to how I want to live my life. I really want to focus a lot on talking about sustainability as a key aspect to that as well. Next slide. Oh, I like what Marianne said, cook edges before spoil, eat or freeze before soil. Ooh, I like that. All right, so here are the two kind of easiest steps when it comes to zero waste cooking. So utilizing reusable bags. So I don't know about you, but currently in my trunk, I have a bag that has all my totes. So for whenever I go to the market to make sure that I can, that I don't need to buy single-use plastics whenever I go to the market. But the add-on that I always love to do as well is actually buying mesh bags. So I can actually store my produce into there as well. So like, for example, when you're walking down with all the fresh veggies that are going around, instead of actually, grabbing one of the bags that are plastic and putting your herbs or your lettuce or kind of things like that along in there, grab a mesh bag. It's going to allow it for it to also store a lot better and longer and have a longer shelf life as well. And then I think the second, and to me, the most important part when it comes to kind of going more towards a zero waste kind of philosophy in regards to your cooking and sustainability is definitely planning. Planning is for sure key. So when I was kind of like looking into what are the different ways in which I can kind of go to more of a zero waste kind of, way of living, one of the websites that I highly recommend is called Litter Less. So if you go on this website, you can actually look at your particular state where you live, and it'll show you the amount of stores as well as different municipalities that they offer, for example, like composting and things like that, that you can actually look into and kind of see what's available in your area. Like for me in LA, my sister lives a little bit, like about 20 minutes away from me, and I love her refillable store that's specifically in her neighborhood because I can bring my own mason jars. I can bring kind of my own stuff that I can store all of like my flour, all of, my quinoa, whatever I'm feeling that particular day, in order for me to kind of do that. And I found it specifically on this website on Litter Less. Next slide. And so here are kind of like the cost benefits when it comes to, utilizing a more zero waste philosophy. Number one, in the long term, it actually saves money. Where's the store in LA? So it is specifically in like Highland Park area. So it's right off of York. If you want to, I'll actually write it in the slide later on in the end of the presentation for sure. So saving money. So specifically, it's roughly about $5,300 per year is what you're saving in regards to kind of going more towards a zero waste philosophy. Not only in cooking specifically, but like trying to be more zero waste in regards to cleaning products, personal hygiene products, and clothing as well. One of the cool things is that if we all do our part in regards to being more zero waste, what happens is that all of the landfill that we saw in the beginning of the presentation in regards to the amount of food waste that's there, the actual diversion of work is going to go more towards creating more recyclables and kind of things like that, and therefore creating different and more sustainable jobs. So by 2030, it's projected that if we do our part to kind of be more zero waste, roughly it'll create about 2.3 million jobs in the United States, which is super cool. And then reduces food waste. That's kind of, the crux of why you want to achieve that kind of more zero waste, philosophy in regards to sustainability. Next slide. All right. So in regards to kind of talking about sustainability and seasonality, if y'all can actually put in the chat as well on like kind of what your thought process is on more seasonal eating and seasonal cooking, I would love to hear them. And the reason why I kind of wanted to talk about seasonality, because I genuinely believe that they go hand in hand with sustainability. A lot of kind of the pros and benefits that we kind of see in regards to being more zero waste, we also see it in regards to eating more seasonally as well. Especially in regards to the last part of this particular slide, it's delicious. I remember my first time, I think we're all kind of creatures of habits. And so for me, I grew up eating tomatoes pretty much all year round. And so I love them. And I'm sure a lot of people probably here feel the same as I do. But then I realized, going down the aisle one day in the summer and kind of tasting it and seeing the stark difference between, what a tomato tastes like in the summertime and what a tomato tastes like in the winter. And also on top of that, seeing the huge price difference as well. So for me, a lot of the times, like actually looking at going down the aisle and realizing like these things are seasonal, they should be enjoyed right now, right? They haven't made the long journey either across borders in regards to state lines and across the country lines to kind of get to our plates right now. So not only are we supporting in regards to eating these things nice and fresh when they should be eaten and they're more delicious that way, but we're also reducing our carbon footprint as well. Next slide. Yes, that is correct. It is called a regrocery. Yeah. So I created a couple infographics for you all. So if you want to actually take a peek at it, so here is our QR code. If you want to grab your phone and kind of take a look at it, it basically is 2 different infographics in regards to not only tips on how to actually start achieving and becoming a more seasonal eater, but also the benefits of what it actually does to your body in regards to embracing more seasonal eating as well. Okay, so I'll kind of pause here for a second if there's any questions. The next part of the presentation, we're going to be talking about more of like the intricacies of how cooking and zero waste kind of go hand in hand with one another. I like that. Yeah, when the farmers market's open, almost all my veggies come from there, even if it's more expensive. Yeah. And pretty soon we're going to be starting our CSA share. So I know that like that specific support in regards like to us, as farmers, I was farming all day today. It really means a lot to us, as an organization and just as farmers in general. So really appreciate the support. Next slide. All right, so stocks 101. For me, I like to call the stocks the compost of the culinary world. So next slide. So here are kind of my tips when it comes to kind of the do's and don'ts when it comes to making your own stocks. So the biggest do is definitely not only to use the trimmings, but specifically to use the skins and the stems. I think a lot of the times whenever we kind of make stocks, sometimes in the very beginning for me personally, I would throw out usually the skins of the onions and even like kind of the hairy part. Don't put that into your stock. It actually adds a wonderful mild flavor. And also it adds a really beautiful, rich color, especially if you're somebody that loves like kind of like red onions. It's one of my favorite of the onion allium family. And also squash as well. The skin as well as the seeds of the squash can definitely easily go into your stock. And then the stems of certain herbs like parsley, for example, add a really lovely subtle flavor. And then the other kind of do is definitely you want to make sure that you want to keep your stocks neutral. And the reason why I say that is because you want to be in control of kind of like how you want your meal to go. You don't want for your stock to be overpowering unless you were making something specifically like maybe a broth that has like that's very rich in like ginger and garlic, right? You want to make that for that particular recipe. But if you're making like a giant batch based on like all the trimmings that you have in your freezer, you really want to make sure that you want to keep your stocks as neutral as possible. So I recommend not really seasoning your stocks. Spices are great if you want to do that, but salt specifically is not the best way to approach it when it comes to actually making your stocks. Because especially if you're cooking a soup for a really long period of time, and soups get better the longer they sit, the longer they kind of cook out. If you put a good amount of salt, especially when you're making your stock, you have a really, really high chance of over reducing. And it's really kind of hard to, I'm a big believer you could fix anything in the kitchen, and we can kind of talk about that later on, but it's pretty hard to do so, especially when you're over reducing something. So try to keep your stocks as neutral as possible. And then the last one, especially if you're freezing your stocks and making a big old batch of it, make sure you don't overfill your jars. So Kim was talking about how this is an 18-month fellowship. I spent the first 6 months of the fellowship up in the mountain. It was wonderful. And one of the big components of it was definitely, we talked a lot about preservation. And so we preserved a lot of stuff in regards to making stocks, for not only for ourselves, but also for incoming fellows. And the amount of broken jars that we had to kind of go through because we filled them all the way up to the top, it made me really sad. So really make sure that you don't overfill it. Roughly about 3/4 of the way is the way to go. Basically, when it freezes, because the liquid needs a little bit of a way to expand, you really want to make sure that you don't fill it all the way up to the top. Any questions? If you do, please feel free to put in the chat. I'm happy to kind of answer them. All right, next slide, please. All right, pestos are a freezer's best friend. So for me, I don't know about y'all, but for when I first kind of started really getting into cooking, before I started teaching it and when I was just eating it, I always thought that a pesto was essentially just like basil, pine nuts, and olive oil. So they could be a lot more. They're a lot more complex than you think. So next slide. And the reason why they are specifically a freezer's best friend is number one is because of the really high fat content. So the great thing about when it comes to making pestos is because you're utilizing either, a really good oil. If you're a big fan of extra virgin olive oil, my recommendation when it actually comes to purchasing oil is you really want to make sure that it comes from a single country of origin and it's first cold press. Those are kind of my two rules when it comes to oil. And the reason why it's because as it crosses international borders, it no longer has to be 100% of that particular oil. So if you see a lot of like blends, for example, like Mediterranean ones, they can kind of put whatever they want to make this kind of Frankenstein oil. So I highly recommend if you are going to make the investment, especially to buy a really good extra virgin olive oil, that it comes from a single country of origin. And first cold press. So essentially what happens is whenever they apply heat to press the oil and you press it multiple times, you're taking away a lot of the nutritional benefits of actually having this really rich, high fat type of oil. So the more it's pressed, the more fats that are in there, they're not the best for your body. So you really do want to make sure that you want to get something that's a really good quality oil. And also if you're going to be using a certain nut, that it's a raw one as well. And so because of that high fat content specifically, pestos can last up to your freezer for up to 6 months, which is wonderful. And then because of that high fat content, it also defrosts really easily. You can like take it from your freezer that evening and put it into your refrigerator. And when you want to cook it after your long day of work, your pesto will already be defrosted and ready to go, which is why I love to have it and utilize it so often. And like I said previously, herbs for days and greens for days. Get creative when it comes to making your pestos, right? I forgot who mentioned it earlier in the presentation, but somebody wrote down that utilizing as much of what could potentially be going bad as possible. I want to definitely use, herbs that are maybe not as happy or greens that are maybe not happy looking and kind of make a delicious pesto out of it and give it life again. So things like parsley, cilantro, arugula, spinach, definitely wonderful, healthy, flavorful ways for you to make a delicious pesto. And then it's not just pine nuts. Actually, for this particular recipe that I'll be sharing with you all today, I didn't have any pine nuts, and also pine nuts are pretty expensive. So I utilize almonds instead for this particular recipe. So get creative when it comes to it, when it comes to making your pestos. Next slide, please. All right. Baking bread. I made a lot of bread during the peak of the pandemic. I don't know how many folks here did. If you want to kind of share your bread making experiences in the chat, I would love to kind of hear that. So next slide. Yes, Christina, the microbiome, appreciate it. All right, so when it comes to the reasons why I would really love for more folks to kind of get into it when it comes to making their bread more often, number one is because it's kind of crazy to me. I had this little bit of epiphany the other day when I was walking down the grocery store, just kind of how long the bread aisle goes and how many of them is actually packaged in single-use packages. So in 2014, out of the 258 million tons of solid waste generated in the United States, more than 63% of that waste was from packaged materials. And a huge portion of that was from food packaging. So when it comes to kind of baking, if you can, try to, bake as often as you can in order to kind of reduce your single-use packaging in regards to the plastics, for sure. And then the second part is that, again, a lot of these kind of ingredients that are core to kind of baking are easily refillable with a lot of these kind of particular stores that are located that can be utilized at little less, for sure. So like things like flour, yeast, salt, baking powder, they can all be easily refillable. And I agree with you. Yeah, packaging is definitely a gift to the world. It does reduce diseases, for sure. I absolutely agree with you. Next slide. And so I find that you are either a fantastic cook / chef, or you are a really amazing baker. I definitely follow the line of being more of a good chef / cook. But our fellows last year, Hannah Durrell, she did a really phenomenal workshop in regards to talking about sourdough, which to me is kind of like if you're talking about like zero waste kind of like baking, sourdough is definitely the Mac Daddy, because you don't need to buy like any yeast or anything along those lines in order to kind of do it. You just have to make a wonderful starter to start. So if you want to take a look on our YouTube channel, it has all of our previous workshops that are there, but specifically for Hannah's, showing her some love, getting started with sourdough workshop is really wonderful to kind of really get a really good grasp on how to make really delicious bread. Next slide. Okay, so let's get cooking, which is my favorite part in regards to kind of talking about food. So next slide. All right, so tips for easier kind of waste when it comes to actually cooking. So these are kind of my 3 go-tos. Number one is composting whenever you can. So actually, when it comes to composting, a lot of states and a lot of cities are actually now providing free or darn near free composting bins to folks. So if you want to kind of do your research and kind of maybe call your local, waste management folks and kind of see if they're actually offering to kind of, help you out with like getting a compost bin, it's a really kind of easy way to make sure that you can reduce your carbon footprint for sure. And then for me, another thing that I really enjoy to do is making sure that I do have either freezer bags, or some type of container where I can put in my my trimmings in order to kind of make sure that I can make stock for a very long period of time, because it freezes really well. I can make stock easily. So if it doesn't go into the compost bin, it's definitely going to go into another bag or bin for scraps for sure. And then the last one, in my opinion, the most important part when it comes to really making sure that you have a really wonderful experience when it comes to cooking is it's called setting up your mise en place. So in French, it translates to everything in its place. And actually, this picture shows a really beautiful mise en place in regards to having the different bowls set out. So not only does it look pretty, if you want to get those wonderful picture, on the Instagram and all that stuff like throughout your cooking process, but what it does is really helps to keep things really organized, and it really just, in my opinion, reduces a lot of stress and decreases the cooking time especially. Next slide. Okay. So these are kind of my two biggest tips when it comes to kind of simplicity in cooking and technique that can really elevate your food. We're going to be making a spring minestrone soup in a hot second. So I definitely utilize these things to make sure that the simplicity of my ingredients were really highlighted, really high. So number one that I recommend is definitely taste your food. So not only taste your food at the very end, when you're about to serve to somebody so you can make your adjustments, I highly recommend tasting your food as you are going for sure. So what this does is it allows for you to kind of like two things. Number one, it helps you to actually build your palate. So for me, because just over the years, I've, like Kim said, my mother's from Ecuador, my father's from Romania. So I tasted a lot of very different food, growing up. So I love spicy and I love sour. Those are the two things that I can't get enough of. And so whenever I'm cooking something, my kind of go-to is to go to those particular things. And I'm constantly kind of tasting my food to kind of see and feel what parts of my palate are really singing and really to highlight them. So constantly have a tasting spoon on you and kind of go for it so you can adjust as you're cooking. And then the last part is knife cuts definitely matter. So when it comes to kind of investments in the kitchen, the one that I tell folks, especially if you're on a budget, I know I currently right now I'm on a budget, but the one thing that I will spend good money on is on a really good knife. And so with the really good knife, I also want to practice really wonderful knife skills. And so I will talk a little bit about knife skills actually as the video is going and why it's really important to practice them and to make sure that your knife skills are as uniform as possible for sure. All right. Any questions at this moment before we kind of start seeing the videos and get to cooking? All right, next slide, please. So tomorrow you're going to be getting a more detailed recipe about everything that that we talked about today in regards to what we're cooking. But this is just kind of like showing just how simplistic in regards to the ingredients that I used for all the dishes that I made yesterday. So especially with the minestrone soup. So I used carrots. We are growing currently turnips on the farm right now. And they were delicious and I just had to put them in my soup. I also had a little bit of celery that was looking a little sad, so I decided to put it in my soup. And then one thing that I wanted to do as well was to use the stems of kale. So in regards to things like collards, things like chard, kale is a really great kind of thing that has the stem itself has a lot of really, really rich nutrients. It actually holds a lot of body in regards to kind of still keeping a really good amount of crunch and texture. So I love kind of adding it to my soups and making sure that it adds a little more depth of flavor and also reducing some waste. So next slide, please. All right. So here are my carrots. And so the first thing that I do is kind of cut off the edges so that way I can put it into my bowl so I can make it for my stock. And so whenever it comes to kind of cutting these things, you always want to make sure that after you cut it in half, you always want to put it cut side down. And so by doing it cut side down, it reduces the carrot from flying all over the place and reduces injury. And also you're kind of able to practice your knife skills a lot easier and really make sure that you're getting those really even knife cuts and things like that. And so for a lot of folks as well, definitely you can use you can peel the carrot skin and actually put it into your stock. But I felt lazy yesterday and I just didn't feel like peeling my carrot. And so I just kind of left it in there, especially in a soup where it doesn't really matter, where you're looking more for the flavor of anything else. And so for me, just the skin doesn't bother me. But if it does bother you, for example, you're more than welcome to kind of, peel it, take it off and actually put it into your stock bin as well. So here is our celery. And kind of the reason why I wanted to slow it down specifically on the celery is because I find that really practicing your knife skills, celery is one of the best vegetables to do that. Because especially when it chops, it's so satisfying. It's one of the more satisfying vegetables, in my opinion, when it comes to actually chopping stuff. And so kind of the motion that you want to do, especially is you want to make sure that number one, that your knife actually never leaves your cutting board. So you're using the tip of the knife to kind of make the cut and using it to kind of push. And with the tip, you're pulling it back. Push, tip, pulling it back. Push, tip, pulling it back. And that's kind of the motion that you want to practice when it comes to actually doing your knife skills. And so I really recommend celery as a really good practice in order to do that. And so next we have our turnips. So very similar to the carrots, I cut off both the ends and put them into my stock. And then what I did as well is I really wanted to actually save the turnip greens. Turnip greens are delicious in regards to the fact, very similar to actually to the kale and to collards, like I was talking about earlier. They have a lot of, they're very fibrous in regards to how they are. So you can add a lot of wonderful acid to make a really delicious slaw out of turnips. So I love to kind of save them and make sure that I utilize them, for later on for other things outside of just making a delicious soup with the meat of the turnip instead. All right, next slide, please. Doing a little replay. All right, so here's kind of my biggest takeaway out of kind of what you saw on this video is really have a solid flavor foundation. And so for this particular soup, I really wanted to make sure that carrot, celery, and then turnips, those are kind of like the three biggest foundations when it comes to this particular soup. And so this picture over here specifically, this is actually known as a mirepoix. So if you look at any kind of traditional French dish, it is always going to have these three traditional vegetables. It's always going to be carrots, onions, and celery. Like every single French dish that you could think of, this is going to be the solid flavor foundation to kind of build really wonderful food. So it's really simplistic. But if you take the time to really, think about like what your foundation of your food is going to be, it's really going to elevate it a lot. And also every country has their kind of version of their mirepoix, for example. Being from California, being from LA, I love Mexican food and I also love cooking it as well. One of the classes that I actually taught when I was out in Hip Cooks was our mole class. And so I kind of talk about their version of the Trinity, their version of the mirepoix. And theirs is onions, tomatoes, and green bell peppers specifically. So every country kind of has their own foundation. Have fun with kind of what you want yours to be and know that kind of each vegetable is going to add a lot of depth of flavor for sure. So any questions before I go on to the next video, which is going to show a little bit more of how to make the pesto. All right, well, if you do, please feel free to utilize the chat and I will definitely get to you. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to be making a cilantro and parsley pesto. So one of my biggest tips when it comes to cilantro is definitely utilize the stem. The stem actually has the majority of the flavor when it comes to what we think of when we actually taste cilantro. And it also reduces the unnecessary step of kind of like taking each individual leaf off, when I could just throw in the entire, herb itself into a delicious pesto. I had some green onions that were left over, so I wanted to use them. And so another thing that I did as well is that the garlic, I don't know about you, but sometimes chopping garlic, even though I love my chopping and knife skills, it's a pain in the butt. So what I did to kind of release those wonderful essential oils, I literally just kind of like hit the back of my knife and kind of released the garlic and kind of release those delicious essential oils. So that way it would add a lot of wonderful flavor to my pesto. And then my other tip when it comes to lemons, so you always want to make sure if you have a squeezer to use it cut side down is how you want to put the lemons into there. I know it seems counterintuitive to do it the other way, but doing it cut side down actually gets a lot more of that lemon flavor. So I put in equal parts almond to equal parts oil. So it was half a cup of almonds, half a cup of oil, and then all of my herbs, the lemon juice. And then the biggest thing that I can really recommend when it comes to making a delicious and flavorful pesto is you really want to make sure that you don't be scared about the seasonings. So because you're going to be using a good amount of oil, and because you're using a nut, a nut that also has a lot of oil in it as well, what the oil does, it kind of coats your tongue, so where you can't taste a whole lot anymore. So don't be scared about the seasoning. So when you're tasting it, you're like, it just kind of tastes like oil. You want to don't be afraid to kind of add things like salt, add things like different flavors, like maybe paprika or white pepper, like I did over here, to kind of add a little bit more depth of flavor to make your pesto really, really sing and delicious. Next slide. And the Mexican trainee is onion, peppers, and tomatoes for Darlene. All right. And so when it comes to pesto as well, so like I was saying, hit as many parts of your palate as you can. And so whenever I'm cooking, I always like to think of this kind of acronym to kind of think about, am I hitting every part of my palate? I like to call it the BS times 4. So the B stands for bitter. So the other 4 S's are sweet, salt, sugar, and spice. So the more parts of your palate that you can actually hit, the more dynamic and wonderful your food is going to be. The biggest example that kind of I can give in regards to hitting all parts of your palate to kind of make your food more dynamic is Thai food. I find that like whenever I eat really, really delicious Thai food, it's like, oh my God, it's salty, it's sweet, it's sour, it's spicy, it's everything. So I really love to utilize things like sauces and pestos, especially to kind of play around with that a little bit. One of my favorite kind of pesto-like sauce that comes from where my mom's from, Ecuador, they utilize cilantro and they utilize jalapenos in this particular sauce. It is amazing. It's my favorite thing to make. I put it on everything. And so definitely have a lot of fun when it comes to kind of making pestos and really having every single part of your palate sing. So again, it's BS times 4. It's bitter, salty, sweet, sour, and spicy. The more parts you can hit, the more dynamic your food is going to be, for sure. Yeah, especially ginger. Yeah, giving that like nice little kind of like sing with the ginger pesto. That sounds amazing. Next slide. All right, so now I'm going to show you all how I actually cooked the particular soup and kind of talking about how to really build flavor when it comes to kind of like making a soup. So the first thing I did is I just had some white beans that were in my cabinet. And so what I did is about a cup of white beans. And then in order to kind of rehydrate it, but not to cook it all the way through, the night before, I just put about 2 cups of water to 1 cup of bean. I just let it sit overnight. So that way it can kind of, get a little bit of a cooking process going by it sitting overnight, but it not cooking all the way through. Because I don't know about you, but whenever I am kind of making soups that do have a bean in there, I find that sometimes it can get a little bit mushy if I try to cook it right beforehand or cook it in the soup. So I like to do this particular technique of actually rehydrating it beforehand. So that way it still has a little bit more of that body. Okay, so if you can press play, Kim, that'd be fantastic. So yeah, again, 1 cup of beans to 2 cups of water. Just kind of let it sit out overnight and you're all good to go. So the biggest thing when it comes to kind of starting and like kind of cooking your food is you really want to make sure that your oil is at the right temperature. So you want to kind of like let the back of your hand kind of simmer over your pot as your oil is getting hot. If you feel that heat with the back of your hand, your oil is at a solid temperature for you to start cooking. The reason why I say the back of your hand is because the front of your hand is pretty much tempered. It touches a lot of hot and cold things anyway, where the back of your hand is a lot more sensitive. So kind of hover it over your particular pot and kind of see if it gets a little bit of heat. And then once it's there, it's at a good temperature, that's when you want to actually add in your vegetables to kind of add that flavor. And so all vegetables, what they do is they have carbohydrates. And so as it's cooking and as it's heating, it's releasing those wonderful sugars and it's releasing those wonderful kind of those things that really give it its wonderful flavor. So does anybody actually know what the term sweating out your vegetables mean? So if you do, I would love for you to kind of write it in the chat. What does it actually mean to sweat out your vegetables? Hmm. And actually, if you do me a favor, Kim, if you can actually replay the video, that'd be fantastic. All right, so while this is going, so essentially what sweating out your veggies mean is exactly what you're doing. You're releasing your water, right? So as you can kind of see, as this is cooking, as this kind of is going on, more and more steam is being released, right? So as the steam is being released, the actual vegetables are cooking, it's developing more flavor, and it's sweating out and releasing all those wonderful carbohydrates. So I don't know about you, but caramelized onions is one of my favorite things on the planet to have. And the reason why caramelized onions are so sweet and wonderful is because it takes a really long time for all those sugars to develop and to really, really cook out. So as you're kind of cooking your food, and you're really developing those wonderful sugars, really give it a good waft. As I like to say, it's a very chefy move to kind of put your hand over the pot and kind of bring the smell to you. If you can really smell the carrots, if you can really smell the celery and the turnips, and they have like their own individual kind of voices and they're all kind of singing together, you know, you can start adding things like, for example, salt, or in this case, in this particular soup, pesto, to kind of then add more flavors that you want to. And then what that does as well in regards to kind of building that flavor. So on the bottom of your pan, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but when you're cooking vegetables, do you see kind of like that browning that kind of occurs in the bottom of your pan? So that's called fond. And so fond is those sugars that give it a lot of really great flavor. And so what I was doing here is, as it was kind of like cooking on down and as it was sweating out and as I was kind of smelling it and really getting all that wonderful aroma, I was adding in that pesto and really scraping the bottom of my pan to kind of get that flavor into my actual my soup. And same with when I added the beans, right? I put in that pesto, really mix it in there. And I didn't put my entire stock into there. I did a little bit at a time. So that way it would actually deglaze and get all that wonderful flavor off the bottom of the pan and really incorporate into my soup. And that was the end product after it simmered for about an hour or so. So next slide, please. And yeah, so that's genuinely my biggest takeaway when it comes to kind of making a simple dish as a soup, is really take the time to kind of sweat out your veggies. So the longer you kind of do that, the more developing of flavor is going to happen, especially with something like soup that's really honoring these wonderful seasonal ingredients. Taking that little bit of extra step to kind of like give it a little bit of extra love, you know, mix it around, add some salt here and there when you can, you know, getting all that wonderful fond, deglazing all of that is going to turn your soup from being just okay to really wonderful and dynamic and fantastic. Next slide, please. Any questions? And feel free, if you want to unmute yourself, because this is pretty much the end of the workshop. And I would love to kind of, you know, hear your voices. And if you have any questions about anything, doesn't have to even be about this particular recipe, I'm happy to answer them. Okay, well, if there's no questions, both Kim and I are going to stay a little bit longer after the workshop, so you're more than happy to ask them. But I kind of wanted to give you all a little bit of an update of kind of what to look out for our upcoming classes. So the next one that's going to be coming up is actually next week. One of our community action year fellows, John Pierce, is going to be teaching an intro into infusions and tinctures with farm and foraged ingredients on the 27th. I'm super excited to be facilitating that class. Johnny really developed a love of kind of foraging and infusions and things like that on the mountain when he was there a couple months ago. He's actually currently our Far Mountain Fellow. So I'm really excited to kind of hear what he's going to be doing with this particular workshop. So definitely sign up for it if you haven't already. Awesome, Darlie. Thank you so much. Made soup yesterday and didn't bother cooking the veggies first. Yeah, definitely give it a try. I would love for you to kind of provide that feedback for sure. And so this particular class is kind of the first in our sustainability series. So I kind of briefly mentioned composting. It's definitely something that I want to get a lot better at. So I wanted to kind of bring somebody onto the farm at Augusta Health to kind of teach about composting. So it's part 2 in our series for composting and farming. It's on June 8th at 3 p.m. At the AMI farm at Augusta Health in Fishersville. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to not only email me, but also to look at our website to register at amifellows.org/workshops. I would love to see you all there. Next slide. So I'll have you end it out, Kim. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, Katerina. Amazing presentation and videos. I'm sure those took lots of effort and we all learned a tremendous amount. We thank everyone that is here for joining us. Of course, you are free to reach out and email us with any questions. More information will be coming to your inboxes tomorrow. Of course, we do these workshops for free. AMI is a nonprofit organization, an educational organization, and we run on the generosity of others through grants and fundraising and donations. And so we always appreciate while we keep these free to make them accessible to the public locally as well as all over the country. We do appreciate your donations. You're also welcome to, on our website, you can sign up for our newsletter to be able to follow everything that is happening, as well as find out about more workshops that are coming. One thing that is happening this week, as spring is here, even though it snowed yesterday, if you are local and you are by the AMI farm at Augusta Health, our farm stand will start this Thursday from 4 to 6. So if you want to come and pick up some of the veggies that Kat was just talking about, you are welcome. We'll also have starts for you to take those seedlings back and plant into your garden so you can cook delicious meals seasonally straight from your backyard or potted plant on your porch. We hope to see you at future workshops, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Katerina and I will stay on for a few minutes if people have any questions for us. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yes, the farm stand is for anybody. You are welcome. The public is welcome to come. We are at 315 Ewell Academy Road in Fishersville, right connected to the hospital property. So you're welcome to come and share your knowledge and see the farm and enjoy some veggies. Thanks for everybody that engaged in the chat too. It's a nice way to feel like we're not talking into space, but enjoying each other.
That's a fun question, Kim, if you want to see what's in the chat right now.
Yeah. We have several farm locations here at Augusta Health. There is not a place to stay on the farm, but certainly lots of places in the area. Our educational farm campus up in Highland County, prior to COVID, did welcome guests. So we did a farm stay, and we hope to open that up again soon. When it does open, it will be on our website, and there'll be a place for people to hopefully stay, as well as join into one of our workshops that we host for our fellows, but also open up to the public. Send us an email. Well, we can figure some of those pieces out. All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Thanks again for facilitating, Kim. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Katerina. Awesome.